The Beatles. There is no argument that they were the most respected and popular band of their day, but the band's 1970 breakup not only sent shockwaves through the musical community, but also caused emotional devastation and wreckage in its wake. The band would go through a period of legal battles over control of the Beatles catalog and the future of the brand. This acrimonious split would cause a deep divide among the four band members, who only a few short years earlier had been nigh inseparable, and a machine that was referred to by the Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger as the four-headed monster. And while it seemed that John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were enjoying their newfound success as solo artists, the last member of the Beatles found it hard to move on, and he would experience some of the worst times of his life. The darkest days of Paul McCartney are up next on If Guitars Could Speak. Hello friends, welcome to the 30th edition of If Guitars Could Speak. If this is the first time you're seeing me and you like rock history content, please consider subscribing to the Guitar Historian channel and checking out my previous 30 episodes, as well as the episodes of my flagship series, Forgotten Fretmasters. Today's entry will be all about my favorite band of all time, the Beatles, the time surrounding their breakup, and the emotional toll that it took on their bass player and half of the legendary songwriting team that created so much of the success that we take for granted in the 1960s. You might be surprised at how low Paul McCartney got in this period. If you've watched the epic documentary Get Back already, this story will pick up right where that left off. But before we take a look, let's have a little history. The Beatles' story and their rise to fame is a ubiquitous rock and roll fable, but many casual fans may not know that it was not the overnight success that some of the later bands of the British invasion enjoy. The Beatles worked tirelessly for nearly 4 years, starting as a young local band in Liverpool in 1956 as the Quarrymen, playing rock covers. They would then move up through the late 50s, playing dance halls, and eventually falling in with a number of groups playing marathon shows in Hamburg, Germany, to a seedy group of patrons in the notoriously rough row of strip clubs and watering holes known as the Reeperbahn. But upon returning to Liverpool in 1961, they would be discovered by a local record shop owner named Brian Epstein, and it would take over 6 months of rejection for Epstein and the band to find maverick producer George Martin and his EMI subsidiary label Parlophone. And if you didn't know everything I already told you, you definitely know what happened next. This began a period of non-stop touring, recording, filmmaking, and traveling that stretched from late 1962 all the way through to their final concert in Candlestick Park on August 29, 1966. The band spent nearly every waking moment together for the better part of 4 years, creating a bond that was deeper than family, deeper than friendship. But the time afforded the group by the lack of touring allowed the four musicians to explore other interests for a short time between the recording of their 1966 effort Revolver and their next project. John would film the Richard Lester-directed How I Won the War in Spain. George traveled to India, beginning a fascination with Indian religions and music that would last his lifetime. Paul McCartney would work with producer George Martin and compose the music to the film The Family Way. When the band reconvened in late 1966 to begin work on their next project, which would become Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, they came back changed and more matured men. They came back with disparate beliefs, new relationships outside the band, and had grown having just a short time on their own. And things would never be the same. Fast forward to the aforementioned Get Back project. Paul McCartney had positioned himself as the de facto leader of the Beatles, having spearheaded the band's previous two projects. The Get Back project was Paul's idea as well, and was set to show the band rehearsing for a final concert that would be their much clamored for return to the stage. As the calendar changed to 1969, the band convened at Twickenham Studios in London to begin recording the Get Back project. Much of what went on during the creation of that, leading up to the iconic rooftop concert on 30 January, is well covered in Peter Jackson's Get Back movie. I highly recommend to all hardcore Beatle fans to watch that. But even though the project spawned many amazing songs and moments in Beatle history, it also foreshadowed the cracks in the foundation that would lead to the band's eventual split. One unseen presence in the Get Back documentary was the name of Alan Klein, who had gained fame, or should we call it notoriety, as the Rolling Stones' Bulldog manager. And despite both Mick Jagger and Glyn Johns warning John to stay away from the master manipulator, Klein clearly had John Lennon in his clutches. Shortly after the completion of the Get Back project, the band met to decide on who would begin to manage the Beatles' financial interests. The death of Brian Epstein in 1967 had robbed the group of both their most fervent supporter as well as their most trusted advisor, and the Beatles' dubious flirtation with managing themselves through the newly created Apple Records had led to total disaster with millions of pounds flying out of the door. John and Klein had talked George and Ringo into retaining him, however, Paul remained wary. With his new marriage to photographer Linda Eastman on 12 March, he favored taking on Linda's father and brother, Lee and John Eastman respectively, to be the band's managers. However, the other three accused Paul of nepotism and rejected the arrangement. To let the tension settle temporarily, Klein was named the Beatles' manager and the Eastmans were retained as their lawyers. But this arrangement would fall apart pretty quickly, leading the other three Beatles outvoting Paul to give Alan Klein sole control of all the band's affairs. Most inside observers would have probably thought that the Beatles as a viable entity were over. Indeed, it was with great surprise that George Martin found Paul McCartney on the other end of a phone call in June of 1969, asking Martin to help the Beatles produce a new album. From the outside looking in, we see Abbey Road as the ultimate swan song, featuring some of the Beatles' best work as a band, but inside the tensions were still rising. John floated the idea of having the two sides of the album feature each writer's work separately, with Paul suggesting a compromise of having side 1 feature all the completed songs, while side 2 would feature a medley of shorter, less completed songs. There was an acrimonious feel to the sessions, with John, George, and Ringo especially remembering the war of attrition that was the recording of Paul's track Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which none of his fellow Beatles particularly saw as his best work. George remembered, quote, "Sometimes Paul would make us do these really fruity songs. I mean, my God, Maxwell's Silver Hammer was so fruity. After a while, we did a good job on it, but when Paul got an idea on an arrangement in his head," John would say, quote, "I hate it because all I remember is the track. Paul did everything to make it into a single, and it never was and it never could have been." Finally, the usually reserved and cheerful Ringo would say, quote, "The worst session ever was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. It was the worst track we ever had to record. It went on for fucking weeks. I thought it was mad." Before the album that would be called Abbey Road could even be completed, however, the first Beatle to release a solo single would be John Lennon, under the name The Plastic Ono Band. Give Peace a Chance would drop on 4 July. Driving a further annoying wedge between John and Paul, Lennon was furious that the pair's songwriting deal had led to the single being credited to Lennon-McCartney rather than just John. Mixing continued on Abbey Road, and the last song on which the four Beatles would contribute to the final mix of an album would take place on 20 August 1969 for the track I Want You, She's So Heavy. This would be the last time that the four Beatles were in the same studio at the same time. Up until 2019, most Beatle historians believed that this was the last time that the Beatles talked about recording anything together. Indeed, just a few months ago in 2021, Paul himself gave interviews talking about how John was the one who eventually broke the band up by leaving in late 1969. However, this news story emerged when Beatle chronicler and master historian Mark Lewison gained access to a tape made by John, Paul, and George in Ringo's absence. Ringo was in hospital for one of his many intestinal flare-ups which he'd battled since childhood. The tape became an absolute revelation in the history of the Beatles. It was a revelation because the trio discussed the band's next album, which was never to be. And the main protagonist of recording in the other album was John Lennon. The recording was made on 8 September 1969, and John's idea was that the three writers of himself, Paul, and George would contribute 4 songs each and Ringo 2. They also discussed the possibility of putting a single out before Christmas of that year. Paul's reaction to George receiving equal billing, however, was less than enthusiastic, with Paul heard saying, quote, "I thought until this album that George's songs weren't that good." My reaction would probably have been to jump across the table and wring Paul's neck, but to his credit, George simply replied, quote, "That's a matter of taste. All down the line, people have liked my songs." John then goes on to point out how Maxwell's Silver Hammer had been unliked by the rest of the group and suggested that Paul give those songs to other artists to record. Paul's response was simply, quote, "I recorded it because I liked it." Paul's dismissiveness of George's songwriting ability And his inability to take criticism from his fellow Beatles may have led to John's decision to leave the group on 20 September 1969. I personally find it odd that on the 8th, John led the discussion to carry on the Beatles in a way that would be more professionally amenable to all, and then only 12 days later announced to the rest of the group that he was leaving. Perhaps it was his perception that Paul didn't really seem interested in patching things up anymore, having been stung by the rejection of the Eastmans and the ongoing plunder by Alan Klein of the Beatles' massive fortune. It seemed at this point that there was plenty of blame to go around on all sides. John agreed to keep his announcement of the departure secret, and there would only be one further recording session for the Beatles without John on 3 January 1970 to finish George's song I, Me, Mine, which John had been dismissive of initially upon hearing it, breaking into a waltz with Yoko to tease George. The project that was Get Back was changed hands, with producer and engineer Glyn Johns being given free rein to clean up the recordings into a full album. But his work would eventually be rejected, and Klein would give the project over to legendary Wall of Sound producer Phil Spector, who would go on to put his special stamp on the project, adding a huge choir and orchestra to the band's final #1 hit, The Long and Winding Road, an arrangement that Paul absolutely hated. This, as well as the bastardization of the rest of Let It Be, would lead to Paul to publicly announce his departure from the Beatles on 10 April 1970. This would lead to decades of blame being heaped upon Paul and not John for being the first to leave the Beatles and dissolve the most popular act in the history of recorded music. Although Paul has tried to clean up this narrative in recent months, it is clear that at the very least, the three main songwriters of the band all had equal parts of blame for different reasons. John and George wanted to explore their own music in their own right, under their own name, and Paul seemed disinterested and tired by carrying the leadership load, having grown frustrated that the rest of the band were no longer following his suggestions. A week later, he would release his first solo effort, a self-recorded and produced affair simply titled McCartney. This would also lead to years of legal battles that began in December of 1970, when Paul sued on New Year's Eve for the dissolution of the Beatles' contractual partnership, and it would take nearly 4 years to sort everything out, ending with John signing the papers of the Beatles' divorce in 1974. That was the public story. This was the narrative that the public knew for decades, until Paul started to talk about the days and months surrounding that 20 September 1969 meeting in which John told the others he was leaving the group. What no one knew then was that Paul McCartney suffered far more than he ever publicly let on. Paul would say in 2020 in an interview for GQ, quote, "I was thought to be the guy who broke the Beatles up and the jerk who sued his mates, and believe me, I bought into that. That's the weirdest thing. It was so prevalent that, for many years, I almost blamed myself. The only way for me to save the Beatles and Apple was to sue the band. I drank way too much and did too much of everything, and it was crazy, but I knew that it was the only thing to do, because there was no way I was going to save it for me, because there was no way I was going to work that hard for all my life and see it all vanish in a puff of smoke. I also knew that if I managed to save it, I would be saving it for them too, because they were about to give it away. They loved this guy Klein." It was a period of deep depression, self-doubt, and self-loathing, and it wasn't made easier by his fellow Beatles as they all conspired with John to make what would be the equivalent of diss tracks to disparage McCartney. Paul's struggles were chronicled by music journalist Tom Doyle in his book Man on the Run, Paul McCartney in the 70s. In this book, he brings many of these dark moments to light at a time when Paul McCartney was at his lowest points and struggling to even imagine a life without the Beatles in it. Paul and Linda returned home to Hyde Park Farm in Argyll, Scotland, the secluded retreat that the couple had bought to remain away from the spotlight and raise their children in a quiet, simple life. But Paul's days became filled with heavy drinking that began to start earlier and earlier in the day, until it was that most days Paul was out of commission by 3 p.m. He began to experience sleepless nights and fed this with tons of marijuana, which he told himself was fine as long as he didn't succumb to the harder stuff like John. He drifted away from writing completely, riddled with writer's block, questioning his own talent constantly. One morning, Paul literally couldn't lift his head from his pillow and thought about letting suffocation take him. Paul would find the energy to simply flip over onto his back, the knowledge that he needed help finally creeping into his mind. But that help would mostly come from his wife, Linda, who would slowly ease Paul out of his doldrums to begin writing and recording in a tiny makeshift studio that Paul had put together on the farm. Linda was sure not to press too hard, simply using Paul's success of the past, building his confidence back up by urging him forward as a writer and pointing out his masterworks in the Beatles. But even then, Paul hesitated to work with other musicians, making McCartney one mostly by himself with some backing vocals from Linda. He struggled with the fear of trying to follow up the Beatles with another band. These songs would eventually end up on the first McCartney album, most notably the song Maybe I'm Amazed, which was a literal storyboard of how Linda, quote, hung him on a line. But what didn't help matters was that a war was being waged in print by his fellow bandmate that sometimes could rival bombings of London and Berlin during the Second World War. John had the ear of the editors of the newly released music magazine called Rolling Stone, and he found a willing outlet to voice his barbs toward McCartney. But Paul would show up in print himself in late 1969 in the midst of his doldrums, and not by choice. In his absence, a rumor began to swirl that Paul was dead. Again, and a small crew from Life magazine showed up unannounced on his doorstep, prompting Paul to throw a bucket at the photographer's head, injuring him. Knowing that the crew had him over a barrel, Paul agreed to give them a short interview and photo shoot. During this interview, Paul let slip that the, quote, Beatle thing is over. However, the gravity of the statement wasn't widely expressed at the time. The McCartney family would appear on the November 7, 1969 cover of Life, along with the byline, Paul is still with us. Meanwhile, John's attack on Paul's songwriting, both past and present, continued to have the desired effect on McCartney's psyche. This only fueled Paul's insecurities and kept him in a perpetual feeling of self-doubt. Years later, Paul would tell of the times when John could cut a man down to size with just a few words. Usually when John's words were directed at him, he would apologize to Paul by looking down his glasses and saying, "It's only me, Paul." But without John in the room, there was no way for his words to be misunderstood. Rolling Stone consistently panned Paul's early work while praising most of John's. With his second release, the now seminal album Ram, which was credited to Paul and Linda McCartney, Paul opened the album with the track Too Many People, which included the lyrics, "You took your lucky break and broke it in two." This incensed John and led to the absolutely insane diss track How Do You Sleep, which ended up on John's 1971 album Imagine, and featured none other than fellow Beatle George on slide guitar. Quote, "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you're gone, you're just another day." And, quote, "The sound you make is music to my ears," are just some of the lyrics in How Do You Sleep. And right on cue, Rolling Stone reviewer John Landau would call McCartney's Ram incredibly inconsequential and monumentally irrelevant. Now we know of Ram as one of Paul's best albums, but it seemed he could not escape the constant barrage of the pro-John musical press, who had set up John as a counterculture icon and hero of the oppressed, while Paul simply continued to make banal commercial music to make money. This kept Paul on a wary precipice between trusting his own talents and stopping altogether. But Paul would say, quote, "It was a choice between going on or finishing, and I loved the music too much to think of stopping." And so Paul and Linda would recruit rock veteran Denny Laine, formerly of the Moody Blues, to form Wings, with Paul feeling that a band concept would give him some measure of cover from the constant vitriol coming from his former bandmates. Wings would release their debut album in November of '71 with Wild Life, which included the plaintive ballad Dear Friend, a naked tune that features Paul's falsetto asking John, quote, "Is this really the borderline?" It seems that this song was received a bit better by John, and the acrimony would mostly die down from then on, with the pair becoming a little more invested in their own solo careers at this point. The formation of Wings had the desired effect that Paul had envisioned, keeping his wife Linda close and beginning a run of success through the 70s that would return Paul to the limelight in his own right. The decade would not be without its barbs, however, with John and music critics accusing Paul of writing mundane love songs. His response to this was the 1976 Wings single Silly Love Songs, which openly invited the audience to have a laugh on him, while also going to #1 for 5 weeks and featuring some of McCartney's best bass playing of his career. Luckily, although the pair never totally reconciled after the Beatles, the relationship between John and Paul had at least cooled to the point that Paul would begin visiting John's apartment in New York many times over the late 70s, and even almost showed up when Saturday Night Live producer Lorne Michaels jokingly offered them $300 if they reunited on the show. Many times, however, they would talk about family, raising their kids, and even baking bread to keep the subject off the acrimonious split of the Beatles. And like the world was, Paul was crushed when his best friend and collaborator was cut down by a senseless killing in December of 1980. He would write the song Here Today for John, released in 1982, a song that he still performs as a tribute to his friend to this very day. It's only fitting that a group that started as a juggernaut and rolled through an entire decade as the undisputed kings of rock music would end in an epic implosion. Not only was the Beatles' catalog and intellectual property worth a ton of money back then, Paul McCartney was also smart enough to realize that the property would probably be worth just about as much today, if not more. Even to this day, everything the Beatles release goes to number one. And even though we're still sorting out the breakup of the most influential act in rock history, it's good to know that eventually the two halves of the most successful songwriting partnership in history were able to set aside their differences and share a few moments of friendship before John Lennon's untimely death. It just goes to show how popular the band still is, that moments from Get Back and pretty much any interview that Paul does regarding the Beatles is still big news across the world. Will our fascination with the Beatles ever end? Well, if you want my opinion, I sure as hell hope not. But that'll be another edition of If Guitars Could Speak. Be sure to subscribe to the Guitar Historian channel for dozens more videos just like this. Also, hit that like button below to let YouTube know that other rock history fans would like to see this. As always, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time on the Guitar Historian channel.